Hope you've got a good cup of coffee with you. I've got my Starbucks here. Like last week, I'm going to be talking in a few minutes about communion today. What can be called the Lord's Supper, or sometimes the Eucharist or the Mass. There are any number of different names by which this sacrament or ordinance is known. Just as sort of a review from last week, the communion or the Lord's Supper is known by several different names. In general, there are four main ways that people have looked at communion. There's a Lutheran view where the body and blood of Christ are present in and with the bread and the cup. A Roman Catholic view, which is where the body and blood of Christ take the place of the bread and the cup, where the bread and the wine literally are transformed. And then a Zwinglian view, which is sort of where most Baptists are today, which is that the Lord's Supper, communion, is a memorial, and that's all it is. And where we are as Wesleyans, Methodists, is pretty close to where the Reformed branch of the faith would be, the Calvinists would be, in that Christ is spiritually present in the meal, not literally, physically, but in a spiritual sense, Christ is present in the meal. The way we look at it, and I definitely think it's the biblical way to do it, is that when we take communion, we're looking back. We're looking back, remembering the Lord's Supper, remembering the Last Supper that he enjoyed with the disciples. We are enjoying communion with each other, communion with Christ right now, and we are also anticipating the great marriage supper at the end, which John describes in Revelation 19. So we're anchored three different places: in the past, in the present, and also in the future, what is yet to come. So what I was going to do today is sort of talk about some of the particulars, some of the nuts and bolts about this. And these are things that are not in any particular order of importance, but what are the elements? When you come to communion, what are the elements? Well, obviously there's going to be bread of some sort. It can be, white loaf bread that is cut up into little cubes. It can be thin little wafers. You can have one big round piece of bread and break it, which is really nice symbolically. It can be, like pita bread of some sort. I was on a mission trip one time where a group of kids they were supposed to pick out the bread for communion, and they got like cinnamon raisin biscuits from Bojangles. It's bread, I guess, but bread of some sort. We're not going to do communion with Doritos or Fritos or chocolate chip cookies, but bread of some sort. And of course, and what about when we talk about the cup? Well, what's in the cup? Traditionally, it would be wine. For the vast majority of church history, it was bread and wine. That's what Jesus would have used. Currently today, in most Protestant churches in the U.S. will use grape juice instead of wine. If you go to a Lutheran church or an Episcopal church in the U.S., they'll be using wine. They might have grape juice as an option, but wine will be what's used. Curious thing about the use of grape juice. Welch's grape juice. And we've all heard of Welch's grape juice. That was developed by a guy named Thomas Welch rather, in 1869. He was a dentist up in New Jersey, I think, and he was a devout Methodist and also a teetotaler. He was active in the temperance movements of the day, and he really didn't like the use of wine in communion, so he developed a way to pasteurize grape juice so that it could last without being fermented into wine, and he developed that for use for his church in communion, and that is stuck. And so if you go to the vast majority of United Methodist churches, Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches, you'll be having grape juice. It may not be Mr. Welch's grape juice, but it will be grape juice of some variety. It'll be grape juice and not wine. I can understand there's something of the color and the aroma of wine which I like in communion, but there's an awful lot of tradition, so no, I'm not going to be switching over to real wine for communion anytime soon. And so, how is communion to be administered? There are several different ways that it is administered. In some churches, everybody comes forward. Everybody comes forward, and they give you a little piece of bread or a little round wafer and a little cup about yay big, looks sort of like a thimble, and you eat that little piece of bread, you drink the little thing of grape juice. Some churches do that. Others will do the same thing, except they will you stay in your pews and pass the tray of bread down the pew, the tray with the little individual cups down the pew. Another way of doing it is by intinction, which is really the way I prefer to do it. You have a common loaf of bread, and you break that bread. And so when you're saying these words, and Jesus broke the bread and blessed it, gave it to his disciples, and said, "This is my body which is given for you," you're literally breaking a piece of bread. This is really visually important to me. And a common cup, and the pastor breaks off the piece of bread and gives it to you, and then you dip that into the cup. To me, that's my preferred way of doing it, but that's a matter of preference, and that's we can all have our preferences on how it is administered. In a higher church tradition, what would happen? You'll normally get like a little thin wafer that you eat, and then everybody drinks out of a common chalice of wine. Again, all different ways of doing the same thing. All different ways of doing the same thing. Little individual pieces of bread with individual little thimbles full of grape juice, passed down the pews. You come forward to get the same thing by intinction, or drinking out of a common cup, as with like a higher church tradition than what I grew up in. All different valid ways of doing it. It's a matter of it's a matter of denominational tradition. What they've been accustomed to doing over the years. So communion also is something that, ordinarily speaking, is done as part of a group of people. Ordinarily speaking, it's done as part of a worship service, or done in a setting where there's a group of people. Ordinarily, it's not something that is done individually, but it's done in communion with other people. Um, and that's ordinarily. I have any number of times I've carried communion to people who are unable to come to church to worship, but but even in that sense, you're extending the table out to them. It's not something that you serve yourself. This is meant to be done in communion with other people. Ordinarily, communion is administered by ordained clergy. In our United Methodist churches, that is extended to be local pastors in their church. But ordinarily, it's done by a pastor. It's not done by a layperson. So what about who should come to communion? This is something where a lot of our churches can differ, and there are several different ways of looking at it. In the Roman Catholic Church, there's a real tradition that communion, that entrance to the table, is linked to confirmation. And so you go through confirmation, and your first communion is a big deal. First communion in the Roman Catholic Church is a really big deal. And in their church, only Roman Catholics are allowed to the table. Only Roman Catholic is allowed to the table. I've been to a couple of funerals in Roman Catholic churches, and I haven't gone to the table. It's not for me. I mean, I don't agree with the practice, but when in Rome, do as the Romans do. It's okay. Some Protestant churches will say something like all baptized believers. Any baptized believer is welcome at the table. So what about children? That is something where I think that a lot of churches have shifted in my lifetime. I think that churches now are far more likely to welcome small children to the table than they were, say, 25 or 30 years ago. And my own thinking on that has changed. And so I think the earlier the better. More conservative Reformed churches do tend to hold to a closed table, so that only baptized believers. So if I were to go to, say, one of the more conservative Reformed churches, like the Presbyterian Church in America, they have a closed table. Only baptized believers can go. I'd go up and take communion. Even though I'm not a member of that denomination, I am a baptized believer. In our little branch of the kingdom, our liturgy says this: all who love the Lord, repent of their sins, seek to live in peace with one another, are welcome at the table. John Wesley believed that someone could be converted at the table. He believed that you could come to faith and receive justifying grace in communion at the Lord's table. And so for that reason, we do have it's our custom, our tradition to have a more open table than, certainly than Catholics do, or even than more conservative Reformed churches do. This issue of who should come to the table comes out of 1 Corinthians 11. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 11, talks about communion right a bit, or the Lord's Supper quite a bit. And he has a couple of verses there, verses 28 and 29, where he seems to say that if you come to the table unworthily, you eat and drink to your own judgment, or own condemnation, however your version phrases that. And it's a matter of how you interpret that, how seriously you take that. So in a more conservative Reformed church, they're going to take that really literally, and if you take communion unworthily, you're condemning yourself. I don't think we should take it that way. Rather, I think that when we come to the table, we should always come to the table humbly and in recognition of what we're doing. It's not something that we do lightly. This isn't something we do lightly. It's something that we do humbly. It's something that, this is something that Christ has done for us. He's offered body and blood for us for our salvation, so we don't take this lightly. So who should come to the table? Well, like I said, all who love the Lord, repent of their sins, and seek to live in peace with one another are welcome in a Methodist church. So what does that mean? Certainly any Christian is welcome at our table. If you're a seeker, you're welcome at the table. If you're not sure but you're sincere and a seeker, you're welcome at the table, because Wesley would say that you could be converted at the table. You could receive justifying grace there. If you're an atheist or a Muslim or a Jew or any other faith, and you have no interest in converting, and don't care, I would suggest you don't come. I mean, it's not, and that's not an offense. That's not to speak ill of them, but that's not for them. There are things in their faith that aren't for me. If anybody of any faith, if they're genuinely curious, if they're of an open mind, come, because you can find Christ at the table. Something else about communion that has changed a bit since I was a kid is the frequency in which we do it, frequency with which we do it. When I was a kid, it seemed like we had communion every quarter. Like first, we did communion every quarter, whether you needed it or not. And I remember hating communion Sundays because I knew that the service was going to go long, and I'd be late eating lunch. I confess. But I've grown up. Paul said, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. So when I grew up, I've matured a little bit. John Wesley preached a sermon one time called "On the Duty of Constant Communion." On the duty of constant communion. And in general, Protestant churches have changed the way they have done communion in the last 50 years, so that more and more now, so that they are tending to do communion more and more frequently. Awful lot of Protestant churches, maybe most Protestant churches, do communion first Sunday of every month. So this past Sunday, first Sunday of July, the 4th, was a communion Sunday. The first Sunday in August in 3 weeks will be a communion Sunday. And I like that. And if you take communion more often than that, that's even better. But for most Protestant churches, once a month is pretty normal now, whereas when I was a kid, it was like once a quarter, which just isn't enough. We need it. Roman Catholic churches, they have it every week. In a Lutheran church, in Episcopal Anglican churches, you have you have the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, as they might be more likely to call it, every week. In fact, the Protestant reformers, Luther and Calvin and their followers, every week they had the Lord's Supper every week. So a couple of other things. You can't take communion too often. Well, I just had it. Okay, so you go to church on a Sunday morning, and then you go to a Sunday night service somewhere else, and they're having communion there too. Take it both times. You cannot take communion too often. Can't take it too often. Take it every chance you get. If you are, in fact, I mentioned this Sunday in my sermon in inviting people to the table, that if things are well with your soul, come to the table and rejoice in doing it. And if things aren't well, come to the table and meet Christ. The only requirement is that you recognize your need of grace. The only requirement is that you recognize your need of Christ. And when things aren't well in here, maybe you need communion more than ever. Communion is a means of grace. It is a means of grace. I know that some traditions don't use that terminology, but in our tradition, the Reformed churches, Catholic churches, most denominations will refer to a means of grace. Activities that we can do wherein we can receive the grace of God. And communion is a chief means of grace. Other means of grace would include prayer, reading of scripture, fasting, almsgiving, or works of charity. All of those are means of grace. And communion, at least in Wesley's writings, is always listed first. It's the most important of the means of grace. When you come to the table, we can meet Christ. When we come to the table, we can receive the grace of God. Some of the holiest moments of my life have been in communion. 2 times I can think of. Once when I was receiving communion, and it wasn't even in a Methodist church, it was in an Episcopal church. I was going forward to take communion in a funeral service. Another time that comes to mind, I was administering communion at a confirmation retreat up at Lake Junaluska. And there is something about this. There is something about this. When we take communion, we're getting food for the journey that is the Christian life. So you cannot take communion often enough. You can't take it often enough. There's no such thing as doing it too often. Take it as often as you can. When you come to the table, do it joyfully, but also humbly. Balance that out. Know that Christ has gone before us, and He offers us for us, and that is something to rejoice in. But also do it humbly, because none of us are worthy to be there. So that is some really good news for a Wednesday morning. Have a great rest of your day.